Good afternoon. I'm Michael Rothberg, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this event with Professor Frances Tanzer, who will be speaking about her book, Vanishing Vienna, Modernism, Philosemitism, and Jews in a Postwar City. This talk is made possible by the 1939 Society Program in Holocaust Studies. The 1939 Society is now a division of the Holocaust Museum, Los Angeles. We hope you can join us at many more Levy Center events this year. You can find more information on other upcoming programs at the registration table near the entrance to this room. As always, I want to thank the terrific Levy Center staff for everything they do to make our events possible. Please now take a moment to silence your phones. And let me now introduce our speaker. Frances Tanzer is the Rose Professor of Holocaust Studies and Jewish Culture, as well as an Associate Professor of History at Clark University, where she also serves as the Director of Graduate Study for the Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, one of the top Holocaust studies programs in the country. She received her BA from the University of Toronto in history and studio art, and indeed she is an accomplished artist as well as a historian. She received her PhD in history from Brown University, where she worked with the leading Holocaust historian Omer Bartov. Today we're going to hear about her 2024 book, Vanishing Vienna, which was published by the University of Pennsylvania Press in their series Jewish Culture and Context, and I believe that there will be copies of the book available after the talk. Frances is also a co-editor of the forthcoming Oxford Handbook of Holocaust Memory and of essays in such top venues as Central European History and the Leo Baeck Institute Yearbook, as well as the edited collections such as Lessons and Legacies. Her research has been supported by a number of fellowships from the Center for Jewish History and the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, among other institutions. All of Frances Tanzer's work is characterized by a commitment to taking culture seriously as a topic of historical inquiry and as a lens through which to understand social and political developments. In all of her work, the Holocaust also serves as a historical caesura that requires us to think across periods, to think the before in relation to the after and the after in relation to the before. We can see these characteristics illustrated beautifully in Vanishing Vienna, the fascinating book that we'll hear much more about in just a moment. With its focus on modernism in the visual arts, cabaret, performance, and the coffee house as a site of critical discourse, Vanishing Vienna places culture at the forefront of her account of urban history. Covering especially the period between the 1938 Anschluss, the annexation of Austria by Nazi Germany, and the early 1960s, Frances's book tells a fascinating story about the interplay between antisemitism and philosemitism and between Jewish absence and presence. It teaches us about what it means for certain kinds of modern culture to be coded as Jewish, to be targeted because of that association, and then to be reconstructed in the absence of a significant Jewish community and integrated into an Austrian nation-building process after the catastrophe of the Holocaust. It's a gripping and often surprising story, and I know you'll benefit from learning more about it directly from the author. Since finishing her first book, Frances's work has taken a geographical turn from Vienna to East Central Europe. We see that turn exemplified in her new book project, Klezmer Dynasty, An Intimate History of Modern Jewish Culture. From the pieces of Klezmer Dynasty that I've read, I can see some of the same driving questions that motivated Vanishing Vienna taken up in a new context. For instance, Frances asks us how one is to think about a musical form, klezmer, after the demise of the culture that nourished it. Klezmer Dynasty puts the focus on Jewish, non-Jewish relations and interactions, something that is also central to Vanishing Vienna. It tracks post-Holocaust attempts at the reconstruction of klezmer culture that necessarily took place in completely transformed circumstances, marked especially by the absence or small community of Jews, and thus also of Jewish, non-Jewish cultural negotiations. As Frances puts it, Quote from one of her essays, "The klezmer from this perspective was the key to unlocking a Jewish past that was inseparable from the story of multi-ethnic coexistence in Eastern Galicia." Finally, let me mention a fascinating just-published article called Film in Illiberal Times, which appeared in the journal Central European History. Here, Frances explores the reception of Jonathan Glazer's Zone of Interest and Agnieszka Holland's Green Border in relation to Polish historical policy and larger questions about aesthetic autonomy and the transformations of Holocaust memory. Frances's original way of contextualizing the films allows her to put forth a very original interpretation, especially of Glazer's acclaimed film. So after today's lecture, we'll have time for discussion of all these issues. But now, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Frances Tanzer, who will be speaking about her book, Vanishing Vienna.
That was such a nice introduction that I hardly have anything else to say. So thank you all for being here today. I heard that rain is a deterrent in Los Angeles for attendance, so I'm grateful to all of you for weathering that deterrence. And thank you so much to Michael Rothberg for the invitation. I'm really grateful to be here and to share with you some of my work, and especially to share my work with some very old friends, colleagues who I've learned so much from, and who I know I'll continue to learn from.
Can you move the microphone a little closer?
I can. Is that okay? Okay. So you tell me if I'm too quiet, yeah? Okay, so I'll begin with the premise of the book. Vanishing Vienna begins with an observation of the significance of Jewish presence in Vienna before 1938. And that significance was numeric, cultural, and symbolic. In 1938, Jews formed 10% of the urban population, or just under 200,000. And it goes without saying that, as elsewhere in Europe, the Holocaust had decimated that population. In 1947, the number of Jews in Austria equaled about 45,000, but the majority were residing in DP camps and sought paths out of Europe. By the 1960s, only about 5%, or 6,000 to 8,000, of the pre-Nazi Jewish population remained. And as Elizabeth Anthony has shown, it was a population that was overwhelmingly elderly. Now, it should also go without saying that this demographic transformation ushered a profound change within Viennese society and culture. As many scholars, such as Lisa Silverman and Alana Shapira and others, have observed, it wasn't just that Jews were a significant minority in the city. Jews and non-Jews had co-created their identities and urban culture before 1938. And in addition to, and inseparable from, the destruction of that pre-war Jewish community, the Holocaust destroyed a network of intimate relations between Jews and non-Jews, together with the culture that had been produced from that complex interweaving of lives and fates. In turn, Vanishing Vienna tells the story of the often surprising consequences of this brutal self-amputation. It was an aftermath in which that amputated limb, that is, the missing Jewish population, was at once foundational, constantly thematized, feared, sometimes romanticized, but also not typically discussed explicitly. And this was a dynamic that almost never led to an admission of the reasons for such a profound Jewish absence, the complicity of the non-Jewish population in producing that absence, and the continuation of anti-Semitism after the end of the Nazi period. Now, considering all of this, my book asks a deceptively simple question. How does a city, in this case Vienna, reimagine its culture in the relative absence of a once constitutive minority? In this case, the Jewish population. And this is a question that could have been, and in fact has been asked, of other instances of forced displacement, genocide, or mass violence. It could certainly be asked of cities undergoing processes of gentrification. This question also relates to a scholarship that deploys negative methodologies to examine the aftermath of violence. Yael Navarro sums up the approach and the need for it quite well. quote, against the assumption of the presence of evidence, such studies begin from an observation of its absence, its erasure, denial, misappropriation, inaccessibility, unavailability, or irretrievability in sites of the long-term aftermath of mass atrocity. Works by anthropologists, including, of course, Omar Boum, who is here, have furnished this negative methodology with ethnographic examples. And for me as a historian, the potential to assess the long-term consequences has been key. Foregrounding absence challenges the afterness of after, along the lines of what Michael proposed in the introduction, by exposing the ways that extreme violence transforms culture and society. And this line of inquiry demands a reassessment of the standard chronologies of the post-war period in Europe and then also in Austria and Vienna. To this end, I present in this book Nazi Vienna, the far-flung experience of exile. I focus mostly on a Jewish experience, and post-war reconstruction as part of a continuous and also violent and fraught process of cultural evolution. So that process begins with the Anschluss in 1938 and eventually produced by the 1950s a coherent sense of Austrian culture and also Western European culture. Now, during this period, conceptual and practical challenges which resulted from the erasure and decimation of Vienna's Jewish population abounded. Conceptual problems because the city of Vienna and its culture had most typically been defined in relation to a real or imagined Jewish presence. And this meant that the very ways for establishing cultural meaning and self-definitions in the city had to be revised after 1938 and then again after 1945. And practical because so many of the key protagonists of Viennese culture had in fact been Jewish and were driven out or murdered during the Holocaust. After 1945, Austrians responded to these challenges in a somewhat surprising way, with, I argue, Philosemitism. And this is the figure that I delineate in the book and that I will focus on for the remainder of the talk. I argue that Philosemitism became a key feature of post-Nazi reconstruction efforts and a sustained feature of discourses of political and cultural reorientation after 1945, where it has offered a tool for defining and also constantly redefining the boundaries of European liberal democracies. But first, we'll require a definition. Put simply, Philosemitism is a desire for Jews. I forgot to advance the slide, but this is actually, just as an aside, one of my paintings, and I decided that it can represent absence, yeah? But we're finished with that now. Philosemitism is the desire for Jews. More precisely, I define it not only as a desire for Jews, but as a desire for what Jews are imagined because of stereotypes to represent. For example, the view that a Jewish presence indicates an exciting, urban, cosmopolitan culture, a set of stereotypes that the book is really invested in historicizing and that we'll discuss a great deal. In other words, though Philosemitism impacts Jews, it is decidedly not about real Jews in all their diversity and complexity. Rather, like anti-Semitism, it focuses on Jews as symbolic and spectral figures and establishes meaning through a discourse of Jewish difference, to borrow again from Lisa Silverman. Jews in the post-war period became floating signifiers, able to absorb many, sometimes contradictory meanings. And the same was true of all of those cultural forms that had been coded Jewish: the coffee house, the cabaret, modernism in the visual arts, and Vienna itself. And these are the areas that Vanishing Vienna examines. So I want to furnish this definition with an anecdote that I think distills some of the key features of post-war Philosemitism. And it's an example that we'll also return to later in greater detail, and it has to do with this fellow. In 1949, a crowd gathered at a train station in Vienna, and they were awaiting the return of the Jewish popular performer Armin Berg, so he's pictured here. He was returning to Vienna after 11 years of exile in New York, Born in 1883, he was a beloved star of Vienna's pre-war popular entertainment stages. In the interwar period, he then also acted in silent films, including in the 1924 film adaptation of Hugo Bataille's satirical novel Die Stadt ohne Juden, a tale that imagined the sudden removal and return of Vienna's Jews, which strangely prefigured his real-life flight and return. The excitement about his return to Vienna had already been brewing for weeks. A poster could be found all over the city announcing that, quote, the king of comedy returns, end quote. And it featured a picture with his crown-bedecked head. By the time that he finally arrived, the crowd was so impatient to hear him perform that they demanded he do so straight away at the train station. And he quipped, "I'm no train station comedian." They would have to wait to see him perform, and they would also have to purchase tickets. And in fact, this effort to drum up sales was quite effective. His first performance sold out 3 days in advance, and the audience prevented him from commencing the performance for a full 5 minutes with their standing ovation. For the crowd, which also included a number of prominent figures from across the political spectrum, he represented an opportunity to reconnect with a more authentic, charming, peaceful, but also exciting, cosmopolitan, and glamorous Viennese past that had been lost and destroyed during the Nazi period. In other words, this was really a scene of redemption. But if the crowd was prepared to celebrate Berg, the big star, the city did very little to accommodate his earthly needs. He faced extraordinary difficulties reestablishing himself in his former home. Unable to reclaim his pre-Nazi apartment, which had been Aryanized in 1938, he resided in a hotel until he finally secured a flat in 1952 with the assistance of the municipal government. Austria's vicious post-war anti-Semitism forms the topic of a number of important scholarly works, and it does for good reason. But meanwhile, Philosemitism has much less often been a topic of inquiry. Among other things, this means that dual experience of being desired and disdained, of symbolic inclusion and systemic exclusion falls out of view. If scholars do consider Philosemitism, they typically understand it through its tight relationship with anti-Semitism. Sometimes they consider Philosemitism to be an inversion of anti-Semitism or a softer version of it. Indeed, they are hardly opposites. This case makes that very clear, and they often coexist. But such a lachrymose approach misses something crucial, something that Daniel Cohen also proposes in his recently published book on Philosemitism, and it's really an excellent text. It's called Good Jews. This model of viewing Philosemitism exclusively in terms of its relationship to anti-Semitism hides the significance and the foundational place of Philosemitism in the establishment of the post-war order, and certainly its significance for cultural reconstruction. So, Philosemitism developed since the last third of the 19th century. It developed alongside anti-Semitism, and in Vienna and elsewhere in Central Europe, Philosemitism took the form of a discourse of cultural assessment that was really pervasive before the Nazi period. So I'm just going to give a very brief history of its evolution before 1938. Scott Spector and others have called this the discourse of Jewish modernism, so that attachment between Philosemitism and modernism. And it was a way of assessing urban and modern culture. Central Europeans revealed modern cultural products and urban spaces as Jewish in order to pass judgment on them. For instance, although the modernist painter Gustav Klimt was not Jewish, he was often accused by his detractors of representing a so-called Jewish taste. Such an assertion represented the anti-Semitic, anti-modernist position. But in response, Klimt often embraced this alleged Jewishness as an affirmation of his outsider status as a bohemian artist. And this was the case in this very well-known painting. And it's something that the scholar Alana Shapira has also written about quite extensively, specifically this painting. And we might call that the philosemitic pro-modernist position. Now, Between the wars, the code was mapped onto urban space. This is a photograph of Leopoldstadt, the neighborhood where many Jews lived, but it was also coded Jewish. As Lisa Silverman has shown, anti-Semites imagined this neighborhood and also Vienna itself as a Jewish space and therefore foreign, defined in opposition to the authentic Austrian nation. This line of thought was really quite pervasive, and it could take the form of a powerful assumption. Many Central Europeans, including Jews, simply assumed that there was some sort of meaningful connection between Jews' modernism in the city without feeling compelled to elaborate. This text, which I mentioned previously, reflected critically on that discourse and the assumptions that it created. So I'm happy to talk about this a little bit more in the Q&A if you're interested. Now, of course, it's always important to underscore that at the same time that Jews were spectral figures in these debates and powerful assumptions, they were also a very real presence, and certainly not always a modernist one. And even more crucially, in the context of this project, though cultural arenas like the coffee house, the cabaret, the modernist art exhibition, and the city itself could be coded as Jewish spaces by that discourse, they were hardly ever only Jewish spaces, and in practice they were zones of intense interaction and intimacy between Jews and non-Jews. And I really love this picture, which gives a bit of an indication of the nature of that intimacy. So this figure, her name fell off of my list of people in the photo, but this is the cabaret performer and director, Stella Cadmon, and here she is with her sort of posse of performers and collaborators. And what's striking here is that they're pretty much equally divided between Jews and non-Jews, so they were working together on a cabaret stage for several years. And about half of them will go on after 1938 to Aryanize the cabaret, and the other half either flee, go into exile, or are murdered during the Holocaust. So we see also that erosion of that sort of intimacy. So reconstructing urban culture after 1945 would mean encountering the challenges and really usually the impossibility of that type of intimacy, as well as the persistence of stereotypes and interpretive frameworks that linked Jewish presence to modern and urban culture. And the relationship between anti-Semitism, philosemitism, and Viennese culture persisted, but it also transformed during the Nazi and post-war years. The discursive order of the interwar period had organized anti-Semitism and philosemitism as cultural and spatial opposites, with anti-Semitism tethered to the nation and anti-modernism, and philosemitism imagined as a sign of urban modernity, cosmopolitanism, and sometimes foreignness. After 1945, that ordering system underwent a pretty major revision. Its iconic Jewish-coded, the nation adopted a selective Jewish presence, modernism, and the city, including these iconic Jewish-coded spaces, the coffee houses, cabaret, modern art, as symbols of Austrian redemption, victimization, and distinction from Germany, and as symbols of Vienna's European cosmopolitanism and predilection for liberal democracy. All of this crucial in the post-war and Cold War context. Now, it might already seem obvious, but this is a story that is filled with ironies. The root of that discursive revision was not in 1945, but rather in 1938. And that means with the contradictory histories of Aryanization and forced displacement. So I'm going to briefly say something about that 1938 period, about that moment of Aryanization, that history of Aryanization and emigration, before turning to the post-war. In the Ostmark, non-Jews erased really any sign of a Jewish presence. This was a process that allowed non-Jews to redefine and absorb previously Jewish-coded materials and figures into arguments about the unique contributions that Vienna was poised to make to the Reich. Klimt again offers us a very good example. The largest Klimt exhibition to date took place in 1943 in Vienna. And in fact, it's the largest exhibition that will ever take place, because some of the works that were featured there were also destroyed at the very end of the war. And I believe some are also still in sort of unclear possession, right, with unclear provenance. But there was a curious revision at this time. The curators renamed portraits of Klimt's Jewish sitters with generic names. And in fact, Klimt was very well known for painting really all of the elite and upper class Jewish women of Vienna, and many of these paintings are featured in the exhibition, but they now have new names. Like, for example, this very well-known painting of Adele Bloch-Bauer became Woman Before a Gold Background. So put crudely, Aryans made Jewish-coded spaces and artistic movements compatible with mainstream nationalistic and affirmative visions of Viennese culture. After 1938, suited to the Reich, after 1945, similar perspectives could be adapted to the Second Republic. However, the reason why Jewish-coded materials were desirable at all was because of stereotypes, their alleged cosmopolitanism and glamour. And through Aryanization, the Nazi project endeavored to establish a Nazi cosmopolitanism and an Aryan glamour, a dynamic urban culture now without Jews. Meanwhile, and in really stark opposition, Jewish refugees emigrated those same cultural materials and used them as an argument for the significance of a Jewish presence in Viennese and Austrian culture. For refugees, Europeanness, cosmopolitanism, and Jewishness characterized the Vienna and the Austria that was being destroyed by National Socialism, but preserved very carefully by the refugees. This was a version of that Philosemitic discourse that linked Jews to modernism and urban culture. Refugees carried out the argument in a number of meeting places, performance venues, works of art, exhibitions, novels. The best known representative is probably Stefan Zweig. So here are sort of a collection of these different venues. Nostalgia was really pervasive in this discourse. Now, nostalgia is always about power and property, and refugees used it to make arguments about their ownership of and belonging to Viennese culture at the time of their forced displacement. This was an understandable and also a powerful impulse, but it also represented a transformation of the understanding of Vienna and Austria. Refugees deployed that philosemitic conflation of Jews and modernism to serve the establishment of an Austrian cultural canon that assimilated modernism and Jewishness into Austrian culture and presented Austria and Germany as totally distinct. The Nazi and emigre projects were obviously totally opposed. Their proponents had very different motivations and disagreed fiercely and also violently about the significance of Jewish presence in Viennese culture. And yet they share some similarities. Both brought Vienna's urban and modern cultural artifacts into an affirmative, nationalistic, mainstream cultural project, a far cry from their former outsider status. The fact that refugees helped to distinguish Austria from Germany and trafficked in Philosemitism created the possibility for uneasy collaborations between Jewish refugees and post-war Austrians after 1945. Of course, that had certainly not been their original goal. But these uneasy collaborations between Jews and state power is a persistent feature of Philosemitism that also distinguishes it from anti-Semitism, interestingly, also in our present moment. So I'll return now to the post-war. What is really interesting in the post-war period is that many people, and people with very different experiences and positions, simply assumed that rebuilding Vienna would somehow involve Jews. Many connected Vienna's famed post-war dullness to the absence of Jews. For example, the German literary scholar, also a refugee in the United States from Vienna, Harry Zohn, wondered how the city would ever regain its prestige without Jews, and this was really a repeated refrain. Now, the persistent association between Jewish presence and urban dynamism meant that discussions of urban reconstruction after 1945 frequently led into discussions of Jewish remigration. Post-war Philosemitism manifested not only as a celebration of what was imagined to be Jewish culture, but also as a fantasy of its redemptive return, or remigration. In other words, post-war Philosemitism remained tethered to cycles of vanishing and reappearance, presence and absence, which could hinder or revive a flailing culture depending on one's perspective. And there were several forms that remigration might take. Usually when we think of Jewish remigration, we think about physical return, the return of the Jewish population or of individuals, more often individuals, to the city. Now, there was very little support for that in any political party. The Social Democratic president, Karl Renner's justification for the resistance to Jewish remigration also revealed his antisemitism. He explained that, quote, in its present mood, Austria would not tolerate the return of Jewish monopolies, which he believed hailed from the eastern parts of the Habsburg Empire. Now, much of the fear of remigration was linked to fears that Jews might demand restitution. An extraordinary statement from the Christian conservative Leopold Fiegel, Austria's first post-war chancellor, linked the supposed race blindness of Austrians to reparations and restitution. So he said, quote, anti-Semitism is a concept that we cannot recognize because it is based on the concept of race. In making reparations, we will not make any distinction according to race or religion. There was one proposal to return Jews, but that's really not an accurate way to put it because Jewish remigration was incidental to the proposal. The proposal came from the Communist City Councilor of Cultural Affairs, Victor Matejka, and he was a rather strange fellow who had emerged at the narrow intersection of communist, avant-garde, and Catholic circles. I love this photograph. It shows him before his collection of paintings of roosters. It also contains some paintings of hens. Apparently the largest collection of its kind in Europe, although I don't know who would contest it. And the collection, it gives us a little bit of insight into him, into his thought and into him as a person. The reason why he was collecting roosters in particular was that his father had been a watchmaker and he wanted to sort of pay tribute to this artisan background, his artisan roots. But it was also because he wanted the roosters around, and they literally poured out outside of the doors of his apartment into the hall, yeah? He wanted them around so that he always stayed alert to the possibility and potential for revolution. So many of them were created by really well-known modernist artists, and again, we see that conflation of communism, modernism, and sort of a totally idiosyncratic understanding of both of these ventures. So he issued a formal call for émigrés, not Jews, to return to Vienna to help to rebuild the city. And he was making good on the promise of communists to rebuild Europe together after the Nazi disaster. He did not appeal specifically to Jews, but in the responses to him, we see how many post-war Austrians conflated émigrés, communists, Americans, and Jews. He would later suggest that the incredible resistance, and it did face incredible resistance to his proposals, were indicative of anti-Semitism. So, by contrast, symbolic return does not raise that thorny issue of restitution, and it might even cover over the need to discuss it. Indeed, it goes very well with Austria's victim myth, adding to it another dimension. Austrians, many argued, had been deprived of the missing cultural materials and figures during the Nazi period. The case of Viennese modernism is once again instructive. The degenerate art exhibition's assault on modern art created the widespread assumption that the Reich had uniformly persecuted modernists and banned their works. The association of modernism with Jews only deepened that assumption of its victimization and increased modernism's capacity to serve a philosemitic rebranding project. And yet, we know that this was not the case in Vienna. We can think of that 1943 Klimt exhibition, but there were also many exhibitions of other famous modernists, like Egon Schiele, for example. But after 1945, Austrians cultivated a myth of modernist persecution, which they typically understood as evidence of their own victimization and also their innocence. Also after 1945, the fact that such materials were now apparently returning, often in the form of exhibitions, was seen as a sign of redemption and distancing from the Nazi past. So often the reopening of coffee houses, of cabarets, also modernist exhibitions are all presented in this way, as a way and a signal of distancing from the Nazi past where that culture had allegedly been suppressed. But this is also an extension of the logic of the Nazi period, which imagined Aryans as victims of cultural oppression. Instead, in the post-war period, Gentiles became victims of Jewish absence, which robbed them of important cultural experiences, opportunities, and connections. In other words, Jews and Jewish-coded artists became responsible for the perceived cultural decline due to their absence, which was, of course, enforced. I examined symbolic return in several zones, and so I'm happy to discuss that more in the Q&A, but I'd like to return now to this example of the popular performers because their stories actually bring together the notion of physical and symbolic return. And again, the experience of anti-Semitism and philosemitism, and not to mention the totally crucial question of how Jewish artists actually fared in this paradoxical cultural system. So that scene of Armin Berg's return was really one of many others like it. And the cabaret was the site of a really startling Jewish presence in the post-war period. Some of the biggest names of popular entertainment after 1945 were in fact Jewish remigrants returning from exile and returnees from camps. Austrian cultural officials, critics, and audiences tended to view popular performers themselves as essential cultural property in the Austrian project of cultural reconstruction. And popular performers returned as souvenirs from a vanished world. So this is a photograph of one of the early post-war performances, and you can see how crowded it is, yeah? One critic, writing about the celebrated Jewish performer Hermann Leopoldi after he returned from exile in New York, imagined, quote, "From the moment that Leopoldi sat down at the piano, one had the most peculiar feeling that he had never been away at all," end quote. Though the reasons for his long departure were never discussed in the press, his absence was frequently invoked. A 1949 program explained that he had braved, quote, "a great journey, and when he returned, he was celebrated by the Viennese public as an uncle from America who came with many gifts," end quote. This program presented Leopoldi in terms of a variety of Jewish stereotypes, now positively valued, that superimposed images of Americans, Jews, and emigres, but excised any explicit discussion of his Jewishness. These comments expose a striking aspect of post-war philosemitism. It usually proceeded without any explicit discussion of Jews or Jewishness. This is what I have called philosemitism without Jews. Jews could be invoked through stereotypes that were immediately recognizable, but with the word Jewish excised, and through images of vanishing and return. And this sort of philosemitism without Jews went very easily together with anti-Semitic exclusion. And again, that symbolic inclusion and systemic exclusion. One reason why Jews were not always mentioned explicitly was certainly the fear that discussing Jews and Jewish stereotypes would lead to accusations of anti-Semitism. This was particularly risky with the image of the anti-Semite now completely inseparable from the image of the National Socialist. But it was also the case that the absence of explicit references to Jews could make the application of Jewish stereotypes more flexible, even creative and generative. When not explicitly identified as Jewish, what was previously alleged to be Jewish culture became something that Austrians could reinvent, absorb, and assimilate into a notion of Christian harmony and redemption, and as a component of a Christian cosmopolitan Europe, an effort that eerily, creepily, continued the work begun during the Nazi period to absorb and recode things Jewish. So the return of Jewishness at the cabaret, or the modernist exhibition, or in the city itself, ultimately makes very clear the type of Jewish presence that would be welcome in the early post-war period. It was a Jewish presence that seldom referred to Jews or Jewish experiences, especially of the Holocaust, but which also transformed spaces and artists that had been associated with Jews due to stereotype into zones for Austria's redemption. Now, it must be noted that this embrace of Jewish popular performers as emblems of official culture represented a really substantial change in their status, a change that was at least in part facilitated by the coded ways that they addressed Jewishness and Jewish experience on stage. Although popular performers had always attracted attention and audiences, they had previously occupied a relatively marginal place in Jewish and Austrian society, but they were now deemed crucial to reconstruction in some way. And the attitudes that were undergirding the official celebration of popular performers were really paradoxical. Austrians desired the selective return of Jewish performers as bearers of Vienna's cosmopolitan and European past, but also understood Jews as outside of the boundaries of Austrian culture and society. And that contradictory scenario led to rather strange and temperamental formulations, as audiences saw performers as paradigmatically Austrian or foreign, depending on the context or the need. It would be completely misleading to say that performers did not resist this instrumentalization of their celebrity and stage presence. And they developed a range of strategies to assert a Jewish presence in post-war Austria. Many of those strategies drew on their exilic repertoires and experiences, so much so that one performer even called return a second emigration. But these strategies were also often misunderstood. And that misunderstanding is important. Popular performance is best understood as a transaction or a co-production between audiences and performers. Each performance might be viewed as a test. Through their participation, the audience can demonstrate their cultural and social competence. But when the post-war performers did challenge the status quo, often by presenting their audiences with Jewish themes or characters, the audiences before them were unable or unwilling to demonstrate their cultural and social competence. And the misunderstandings and erasures that ensued, often really without the audience being the wiser, reflected a fundamental fissure in the ability to mutually constitute urban life and culture. Stella Cadmont, who I mentioned earlier, this is a picture of her at a much later stage in life, so in the post-war period. She returned to Vienna from exile in Tel Aviv, and she registered the change in the audiences really right away. She returned already in 1947. She said, quote, "From the cabaret, the public expected easy art cheering up and to laugh at idiotic jokes. They wanted only not to think, to forget everything that was so terrible. They wanted to forget and in some time, probably to prepare themselves for a new misfortune, because they had already forgotten the old one." Elsewhere, she was much more explicit. She said, quote, "I had always had my Jewish audience. Since that was no more, I lacked a context." In other moments, she also talked about the problem she faced creating programming in the absence of Jewish collaborators. So, by way of wrapping things up, I would like to draw out a few of the main conclusions of the book. And of course, there's a lot I didn't discuss today, despite saying a lot. So looking at Philosemitism and antisemitism together exposes these two faces of Vienna that reflect this paradox at the very heart of urban culture. Few Austrians wish to return Vienna's Jewish population as it had been before 1938. Meanwhile, many politicians, officials, and cultural figures hoped to revive the urban and modern version of the city that had been really strongly associated with a real and imagined Jewish presence. And that latter effort apparently required the selective or temporary presence of Jewish artists and Jewish coded materials. Now, a second related issue that the book investigates is the transformation and circumscription of a critical capacity in urban culture. For Jews and non-Jews, the confrontation with Jewish absence necessitated a change in the tools available for cultural criticism. Satire and cultural criticism that had been based on everyday interaction in the city gave way to nostalgia and ideological posturing, so that the key questions of the post-war period were, what is Austrian? How is Austria European? How is it still Austrian? Though the formal inquiry of the project ends in the 1960s, the potent symbolic power and critical potential of rediscovering vanished Jews has persisted. The variety of philosemitism that I've been discussing, inseparable from Jewish absence, seems to emerge in each moment when the boundaries of Europe are shifting or contested. In fact, it seems to reappear in each moment of political and ideological transformation. So including during the 1950s, when the need to establish distance with Germany was profound. This is the moment that this book explores. But then also in the 1960s, the process of revealing a Jewish past was instrumental in a generational critique that sought to reform institutions and articulate important political differences with the older generation whose reputation was tarnished by their association with National Socialism. In other words, both the 1950s and 1960s generations rediscovered Jews and modernity belatedly, sometimes incompletely or inaccurately, as a way to establish ownership of a supposedly authentic version of pre-war Vienna. The cycle continued with discussions of the Central European idea in the context of the geopolitical reordering after the collapse of that Cold War bifurcation. And today, it appears in fraught discussions of migration, which frequently tether Islamophobia to philosemitism. And it's interesting to note that some of my thinking about the topic cohered as I did research in Vienna in the context of what was at the time called the refugee crisis in 2014-15. In that moment, a left liberal camp tended to propose that Jewish absence offered a premonition or a warning of the cultural consequences should Vienna's doors close to refugees and migrants. But by contrast, conservatives and right-wing parties tended to present the Jewish past as part of a European civilization that might be threatened by the presence of racialized, usually Arab or Muslim refugees and migrants. Actually, the same people could echo both perspectives. And the reason for that was that they shared an undergirding commitment to presence and absence as a way of establishing meaning. But one of many challenges with presence and absence as a model of critique is as follows. Even when its proponents are sincere and build on the legacy of the Jewish past to promote diversity in the present, it potentially reinforces the assumption that Austrians or Europeans and Jews, today migrants, Muslims, or Arabs, are all distinct groups. In addition, it proposes that if outsiders are to be welcomed at all, they must come bearing gifts. Thank you.
You can hear us. Okay, thank you so much, Francis. It's really a wonderful book, and it was great to get a chance to hear your kind of after reflections on it and to go back through some of the arguments. You stressed quite a bit the question of Philosemitism in your talk. So I thought maybe we could start by talking a little bit more about that. It strikes me, I mean, it's a fascinating topic, and the way it's woven together with anti-Semitism is, I think, partly what makes it so fascinating. It also seems to me that it's become an increasingly discussed phenomena. And you referred to the book Good Jews, which I've also been reading recently by Daniel Cohen, I think it is. So I'm curious why you think there seems to be kind of a philo-Semitic turn, or a turn to thinking about philo-Semitism at the same time that we're obviously involved in an ongoing discussion about anti-Semitism. So I just wonder if you had some thoughts about why that has become such an object of study and discussion at this moment.
So I mean, one of the conclusions of the book is that philo-Semitism seems to emerge more forcefully in moments, and this is in the European context, although we can also talk about it in the United States, but I think it has a slightly different dynamic. But that in the European context, philo-Semitism seems to emerge more forcefully in the moments when the boundaries of Europe, conceptually, are being redrawn. And so in this present moment, what's really striking is that illiberal actors are also adopting philo-Semitism as part of their discourse. And they do this, again, at the very same moment that they're also talking and really explicitly anti-Semitic. So this is something that has many different manifestations. In some of my more recent work, I've thought about that dynamic in Eastern Europe. And it's not totally different from the dynamic that emerges in Central and Western Europe, I think. And I would say that the present moment is also an extension of the discussions and really intense debates that emerged in the moment of refugee crisis in 2014-15, where now there's a desire to redraw the boundaries of Europe in a way that is exclusive of migrants, mostly from the global south. And so in this way, it becomes tethered to Islamophobia. And one of the things that's really interesting about Daniel Cohen's book is that he also talks about a slightly different manifestation of philo-Semitism, which is a manifestation that is also focused on an appreciation for Israel and Israeli culture. And this is something that my book does not explore because I'm primarily focused on this urban historical case and tracing that longer trajectory. But that's another way in which we see it in our contemporary context. And I think that also brings in the really our immediate context of the United States.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, yeah, fascinating. Your book is not really about memory as such. That's not a key word particularly in the book, though nostalgia is clearly something closely connected to it. And it's also, I mean, it's obviously, it all takes place around the Holocaust, but the Holocaust itself is not, again, at the center of what you're talking about. It's more the impact, the effects, obviously, of the Holocaust, both on the Jews of Austria and also on Austrian culture, on Vienna and Austria more generally. But it seems to me that it has interesting implications for thinking about Holocaust memory. So I wonder if that's something you've thought about. I know you're editing a book right now on a kind of on Holocaust memory itself, on the history of Holocaust memory, and I wonder if you have thoughts about how this study might speak to that.
What I was really interested in thinking about in this book are the foundational cultural assumptions that some of them cross over from the Nazi period to after. There's also a moment of transformation, but I wanted to understand the cultural logic of the early post-war period, which is one that is really characterized by this dynamic, at least in Vienna, and at least in Austria, but this dynamic between philo-Semitism and anti-Semitism, presence and absence. And what's striking about the early post-war period, and this goes back to some of my previous remarks in response to your prior question, is that in order to prove their belonging to, Western European, Central Europe, but Western European in this case, meaning not Eastern European, not communist, so Western European, liberal democracy, post-war context, Austria needs to embrace, or believes that they need to, embraces different manifestations of Philosemitism, even in the very early post-war period. So one of those manifestations that I detail really extensively in the book is a commitment to modernism and to the aesthetics of modernism, at least in international representations and international exhibitions. And that's also part of sort of redrawing the boundaries of Europe in that crucial post-war moment. And I think that actually sets, it's sort of interesting with the music playing simultaneously, but this is also the foundation in which Holocaust memory emerges later in the century. So it's not that all of Holocaust memory, that whole matrix, could be reduced to this dynamic of Philosemitism and antisemitism. That would be ridiculous. But that it is one of the conditions that facilitates the emergence of Holocaust memory later. And the image of the Jew that is important in that moment is the Jew as victim.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I can see how that then carries into the present in important ways. Let me ask one more question, then I'll open it up to the audience. So formulate your questions in the meantime. Another theme that sort of struck me as central to your work as I was reading the book and other more recent things was the question of complicity. And that comes out really powerfully in your new essay on film, in illiberal times, and especially in your really, I thought, wonderfully, unexpected reading of the film Zone of Interest, which is a film I thought was very powerful, about a film about complicity and has been read as a film about complicity. And one of the things that you show in this piece is it's not only a film about complicity, but it's a film that is itself complicit in unexpected ways in certain kind of historical politics, especially in Poland, right, where it's filmed. And in the book, in the Vienna book, there's some really surprising things about the way that emigre culture ended up, obviously inadvertently, complicit in constructing a certain notion of Viennese culture and of Austrian culture that would become handy, I guess, for the reconstruction of Austria after the Nazi period in a way that allowed Austria to evade a certain kind of responsibility for what had happened, at least as I understood it. So complicity in unexpected ways coming up in your work. So I wonder if you would want to say anything about that.
Yeah, so in the context of the book, what I propose, and also what I tried to emphasize here, is that Philosemitism creates, to use Glazer's words, a zone for complicity, because what I said before the talk is probably better than the context of the book. I think that your model of implication is actually a better model. So it creates a very narrow opening for Jews in the early post-war period to participate in cultural reconstruction, in some cases to regain their status as important cultural figures, not in many cases, but in some cases. But the condition for that is that they either remain silent about what had happened during the Nazi period, or that they are comfortable with when they do say things, and they do. So it's not the case that Jews in the early post-war period are just totally mute on the topic of the Holocaust. There are actually many different moments where they speak about that experience and their experience in really sort of powerful and moving ways, but the condition of the post-war period is one where when they speak, they're probably not going to be understood or heard. And this is a really complicated dynamic, and I was interested, and this brings us into the zone of interest article, I was really interested in understanding how artists navigate those complexities. So a really genuine desire and a need for an audience and people who appreciate your work, and then also the sort of compromises that can go together with that in such a fraught historical context. In the context of the zone of interest article, actually something I didn't think about it this way, but there's another dynamic that is also in parallel with the book, which is an interest in what happens when cultural projects that take place in like very different contexts are then adapted somewhere else. So in the context of the zone of interest article, I was honestly really troubled by this film because on the one hand, I found it to be really powerful and such a powerful set of ruminations and observations about how to think about complicity in the context of the Holocaust, but not only, and then also how to represent that, how, like, what aesthetic tools to deploy to represent and to really illuminate some of the problems and tensions and really to grapple with this topic. At the same time, this is a film that fits really beautifully into the politics of illiberal Poland. So the film is also a film that really goes along with, that really doesn't contest what's called the policy on history, which is the policy of the Law and Justice Party in Poland, which was in power at the time when the film was produced, and then also when it came out. And in fact, it was endorsed by important state funders in Poland who really would not have endorsed a film that had challenged their sort of status quo view. So I was interested in that article in examining how a film that is so invested in thinking about complicity then also becomes complicit in these really interesting ways, and then also benefits from the misunderstanding that will inevitably ensue when the film is watched in different contexts. So in Poland, the film is read in one way, and actually many Polish audiences had a sort of strange and ambivalent reaction to the film because they often viewed it in terms of that policy on history. And then internationally, it's really celebrated as this important film, this important rumination about complicity, and little is known about the Polish context, so it doesn't really matter in the international sphere. So that dynamic between a sort of national project and then international translation, and also film is actually sort of inherently deals with that, especially in international co-production, which this was.
Right. Yeah. I was really struck. I hadn't noticed when I watched it that Jewish victims are not really named in the film. I think you say that, right? Mm-hmm. That it's not explicit. And yet, I guess watching, what Auschwitz is. You just sort of assume that these are who the victims are, and yet it's interesting then to see how that kind of opens up this zone of ambiguity. We have a question in the audience, so yes.
All right, Brave the Rain, to come to hear about Vanishing Vienna, and I'm grateful to you for your presentation. It was rather theoretical, but I was looking for what was the Viennese culture that vanished. It cannot be just the vulgar cabarets and the coffee, and then it be something else. I would have liked to see some interesting Jewish writers, philosophers, architects that created the actual culture that we think of Viennese culture, and nothing here was represented. Even the life of Stefan, and there were no examples of anybody who was Jewish who contributed to the famous Austrian culture. Even Stefan Zweig, who committed suicide, was missing that culture. But what was that culture? Except those vulgar cabarets. I didn't get anything from the lecture on that, and I feel very bad about that.
So Thank you. I would not call the cabarets vulgar, but I mean, what's interesting is that, so in the project, I'm really thinking about both Jewish experiences and also about how non-Jews are thinking about the past and also erasing it, and actually how both groups are erasing the pre-1938 period. But what they're doing is they're also inventing it as they go along. So they're also inventing that pre-1938 period, so it really becomes sort of a fantasy for both Jews and non-Jews. And this is also true of Stefan Zweig. So he's totally nostalgic about the end of the 19th century, about this moment that he sees as a moment of liberal Jewish ascendancy in the city, where Jews are playing this really crucial role in creating what he's focused on as really high culture. And this is also in many ways a fantasy. So the book is really dealing with different people's fantasies, including Jews. So most of the people I talked about were actually Jewish. But also the way that non-Jews are fantasizing about Jews and about Jewish culture. So in this sense, it's really not about that earlier period. It's about what happens when Jews and non-Jews are really invested in the project of reinvention. Jews because they're forced to be, and non-Jews because they...
What? If you give any examples of what was the Viennese culture that vanished?
This is just not what the book is about. It's actually about the process of vanishing and reconstruction. So I would be happy to talk to you about the culture that vanished, but this is a different lecture.
Thanks. David?
Well, just another person's opinion. I thought the lecture was actually a very nice mix of descriptive, remigration, and theoretical, and I think I kind of understood what you were trying to recreate, which was not that remarkable interwar cultural fluorescence. But I wonder if what I was wondering about is whether you could map the cultural logic that you described onto sort of the political logic of post-war Vienna, sort of that very complicated project of rejoining the fraternity of nations, that project of reconstruction of a political entity and maybe imaginary. And I'm thinking in particular of two personalities who kind of frame the beginning and the end of the period that you're interested in. The first figure of Kaloven, Tanzer, president, very central figure in Central European political and cultural political thinking. And then at the end of the period, which is probably a bit beyond the period you're interested in trying to track philosemitism, antisemitism, Bruno Kreisky, who enters the picture, I think, as foreign minister of the late 50s. So I'm just wondering how the dynamics you're tracing map onto that larger political map, and whether you see, I mean, surely you embedded your story in that larger political frame. So what do we learn?
So your question is the question that Anson Rabenbach asked me right when he finished reading the book. And it's such a good question, and it's, I mean, the figure of Bruno Kreisky is actually in many ways the perfect manifestation of this dynamic that I'm talking about, because he is both Jewish and not Jewish. He's representative of this sort of cultural universe that I wrote about. He's cosmopolitan and definitely Austrian, and he is really kind of the perfect manifestation of the dynamic. And I think that what's also striking is he is in fact a little bit outside of the time frame, although I talk about him in the conclusion in exactly this way. What's striking is that in the moment when he becomes such a powerful political force in Austria, it's also a moment where it becomes possible to talk about, when it becomes possible to actually talk about Jews explicitly, which is also interesting. And his, explicitly, more within this cultural framework. And I think that actually his dispute with Wiesenthal gets at some of these dynamics too, in a really interesting way that then brings it more squarely into the political sphere. Absolutely.
What about Bennett? Does Bennett figure at all in
Yeah, I talk about him a great deal. So he's sort of...
Balancing act?
Yeah, he's part of that balancing act, but he's also really, so at the way that I talk about him and in the moment that I talk about him, it's the sort of earlier 1950s moment, and he is really involved in a fascinating way in creating with Christian Democrats across Europe this philo-Semitic, without Jews, appreciation of Viennese culture as a sign of Catholic cosmopolitanism that will unite Europe and will actually prove to be, in their minds, a foundation for some sort of European integration. So in the book and also in my thinking, he's really evocative of that specifically.
Yes.
So I'm looking at this.
Oh, here comes a microphone for you.
Thank you. So I'm looking at this example of philosemitism that you gave in this cabaret, and I'm looking at a bunch of middle-aged people who lived through the war in Vienna, presumably. And I'm just wondering to what extent this philosemitism is driven by guilt. I mean, how did these people behave during the war? Are they now attending this Jewish-coded performance because of their former guilt? Is this something we might these days call virtue signaling? I mean, are these people who are, are they really philo? Or are they just, people who lived through the war, they don't feel good about it, and they want to show they're not now and have never been an anti-Semite? Now, it's a cynical question, but I'm just asking for your opinion on it.
I can give you both a cynical answer and a not cynical answer. But what's interesting, so these photographs, there are a number of them in different archives in Vienna, and they really shocked me. So I'd been reading about the performances for some time, and in fact the project really, I came to it because I was reading in the newspapers of the early post-war period these celebratory accounts of Jewish performers returning from exile and the way that they're greeted at the train stations or the sort of enthusiasm for their work. And this just did not square with what I thought I knew, or what I did know, about how unbelievably anti-Semitic Vienna was in the early post-war period and beyond. So I really wanted to then understand that dynamic. And these photographs, I think, represent a few things, but I'll talk about two, and one of them is really along the lines of what you just suggested. I might not say that guilt is a motivating factor here. I'm not sure that the people in the audience were actually thinking very much that they should feel bad for what had happened. They're definitely trying to avoid discussing the Holocaust. That is absolutely a motivation. But they are consuming something, and what they're consuming, in my perspective, is a sort of a cosmopolitan culture, a joyous culture, a form of humor that they believed had been destroyed, but in fact, actually many of the cabarets remained operational for the whole of the Nazi period, with the exception of the final stage of the war, and then just without Jews, yeah? So many of them had been audiences the whole time. It's just that now there were Jews performing. The second thing is that in the early post-war period, there was a real lack of any sort of entertainment initially. And then the resurgence of any type of entertainment was greeted as some sort of return of the city. So they're actually, the audience members in these very early shows are, I think, experiencing the return of dynamism to the city, which they also sometimes interpret as related to the return of Jews to the city. What's also interesting about these performances is that the Jewish performers are often performing with the Aryanizers, with the colleagues who they had worked with sometimes in the interwar period, who had actually been responsible for Aryanizing the cabarets. So these are really complicated scenes, actually, and in fact another lecture would dissect them. But I think that they're trying to evade, so that's totally right. They're trying to entertain themselves, and they're also trying to maybe for a moment believe that the city is once again cosmopolitan and has somehow been revived. And Jewish presence plays a role in that feeling of revival, as disturbing as that is.
Yeah, back here, and here comes the mic.
Sorry, just to follow along with that thread, I was wondering, and thank you for this wonderful talk. I was thinking about the relationship between Philosemitism and the resistance to restitution.
Mm-hmm.
So you have these episodes of entertainment where people are lauding the return of Vienna, the Jewish presence in the city, but I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about why there was such resistance to material efforts that could have been made to facilitate that re-migration in some way. Was it because the former population of the city didn't want to return? Is it because they had already moved somewhere else? Or if you could just talk a bit more about that. Thank you.
This is such a good question. And there's intense resistance to restitution in each context in post-war Europe. The resistance coming from sort of obvious and expected places. Non-Jews had seized Jewish apartments, had looted Jewish material property, taken the jobs of Jews. In the context of the cabaret, this is also interesting because non-Jews had also seized ownership of many of the cabarets. And I think that Philosemitism goes very well together with that resistance because it creates the impression, at least this version that I've discussed here, it creates the impression of, again, this cultural revival, but also a sense of victimization among non-Jews, that non-Jews had somehow been victimized by the absence of Jews. And again, this is all sort of, the key here is that this is a world of stereotypes and fantasies. So if you genuinely believe that urban culture requires a Jewish presence to be exciting, then the absence of Jews would mean that the urban culture can no longer be exciting, and then the victim of that process would actually be the non-Jew. Now, this is obviously totally perverse and twisted, but this is actually the cultural logic of that early post-war period. And so from that perspective, Austrians are now victims of this cultural degradation in the city, and they could also be victims, now transferring to the anti-Semitic orientation to anti-Semitism, they could also be victims of Jewish return if Jews demand goods, right? If Jews demand that they want their apartments back or they want their job back. So these two dynamics are actually really, I think, going together extremely well in this period. And then that kind of relationship takes a slightly different form in other moments. But in the early post-war period, that resistance to restitution is clearly a motivating factor for both anti-Semitism and philosemitism.
I was wondering, as I was reading, I kept thinking about Los Angeles as a site of exile. And it doesn't come up much in the book. There's a short section about Schönberg, as one of these people who's basically spurned, I think, from not given a real opportunity.
Thanks to Joy's work,
Yeah.
Joy Calico's work.
Yeah. So I don't know. I wondered if there's more to say about Los Angeles, or I was also thinking about what is the relationship between the sort of Austrian story and the Austrian Jewish story and the German Jewish story, because of course a lot of German and non-Jewish and Jewish German exiles in LA. So I don't know if that's something you've thought about at all.
Yeah. So Los Angeles really does not come up very much in this book. And I will just admit to you and confess that part of the reason for this is the way that I pursued the research. So I really followed certain key protagonists, and I kind of followed them backwards. So I was interested in people who were involved in some way, not always physically on the ground, but involved in some way in cultural reconstruction after 45. And then I traced backwards their biographies, so traced their work backwards, thinking about, okay, well, had they been in exile? Where were they? And many of the people who were involved in the post-war period were not in Los Angeles, at least the ones who I looked at. Yeah, this could be, someone could write a whole dissertation about this that tells a different story. But the relationship between German and Austrian emigres is really fascinating. What is sort of obvious in that relationship and also quite interesting is that Austrians had Austrian Jewish refugees, mostly from Vienna, but not only, had a recourse to Austrianness and Viennese culture in a way that German Jews really did not during the Nazi period. And also, Austrian Jews had a motivation to actually separate themselves from Germany, particularly once the countries to which they had fled joined the war effort. So this was actually sometimes an existential need. They needed to distance Austrian culture from German culture in order to ensure that they're actually not going to wind up in a camp of some kind, or that they're not going to be deported from the place where they fled. This is particularly true in different Latin American contexts. So they have this recourse to their national culture in a way that Germans mostly do not, and this, I think, facilitates really pervasive nostalgia, which I present in the book as not only about one's own desire or longing for the culture that you had fled or left behind, but also as a method of community building. So the nostalgia for Vienna is actually not only something that Viennese Jews or even Austrian Jews partake in, but actually Central European Jews more broadly, so from former Habsburg states, are involved in nostalgic projects that are often nostalgic for Vienna. Prague Jews are also participating in some of these social spaces. And the result is really the formation in exile of different communities. It's quite fascinating. But also, there's a desire to use nostalgia to actually make arguments about possession of culture. So Austrian Jews are able to use nostalgia to say, actually, Jews are really central to Austrian culture and belong in Austrian culture, have an important place there. So this is sort of an interesting dynamic that I just think is not as available to German Jews. However, I do think that the German Jewish resistance to nostalgia during the Nazi period probably needs to be reassessed too. And I think that because I have some colleagues who are doing parallel work also on German Jews, and they find that when you start to look at popular entertainment, when you start to look at popular venues, German Jews also express some version of this in certain contexts.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Frances Tanzer, for coming to UCLA and speaking with us about your book, Vanishing Vienna.